Well, good morning. I'm glad you're here. If this is your first time to come, or one of your first times, we appreciate you coming. I know sometimes it's hard to walk into a new place, so thanks for doing that. And if you're joining us online, again, thank you for doing that. Now, normally I don't want to take away from the start of the sermon, but I've got to take issue with something that was said in the highlights. We're going to, where's my native Spanish speakers? I got a native Spanish speaker back here. Any more? We're going to Pan de Vida. How does that sound? Okay, when I went to the Language Institute, they'd say, we'd make a mistake like that, they'd say, suena muy gringo. You sound like a gringo. Those of you who took Spanish, is it Pan de Vida? No, it's not, Kristen. No, it is. What is it? Pan de Vida. Thank you. We will work that out before we will go. We are going to Pan de Vida. I feel better. You feel better? Okay, March 2023, Evan Gershkovich is a reporter for the Wall Street Journal in Moscow, Russia. He's arrested on a bogus charge, but it's a political ploy. July of 2024, he's sentenced to 16 years in a penal colony for espionage and spying. Imagine you're Evan's mother or father. You're cut off. You love your son. You don't know if you'll ever see him again alive. There's a divide. There's a break there. Fast forward ahead a year. There's diplomatic negotiating going on, and finally a deal is reached. And on August 2nd of this year, he's released to U.S. Authorities in Ankara, Turkey. He flies from Moscow to Ankara. I watched video. His mom and dad were in Ankara. Don't you think they'd be there? What do you think that restoration was like? I think he's 33, 34. Man, I think they hugged their son like they never hugged him before. Didn't know if they'd ever see him again. And there he was. It's a great story of restoration. But there's an infinitely greater story of restoration. It has to do with me and you, and in fact, every person born in. We are cut off from God. As much as Evan Gershkovich is stuck in a Russian prison for how long, we're stuck in an eternity separated from God until Jesus steps into the picture. He takes the penalty that's ours. And what I want to ask this morning is, how should we respond to God's work of restoration? The parents said, we'll get over to Ankara. We'll be there when our son is set free. How should we respond to God's work of restoration? We're going to talk about it. So if you got a Bible, if you can open it to Nehemiah chapter 10. We're going to go through chapters 10, 11, and 12, wrestling with that question. How should we respond to God's work of restoration? God's work of restoration. You haven't been with us. We've been going through the book of Nehemiah. This is 7. We got one more week. And it's a story of restoration. The city was sacked in 586 BC by the Babylonians. But God said, that's not the final story. I'll raise up a world power, a new world power, Persia. He even names the king 100 years before it happened, 150 years before it happened. His name's Cyrus. Cyrus will issue a decree, and you go back. And so the people have come back in waves. But they found out a city that was destroyed. So the first wave was under Ezra, and they rebuilt the temple. Nehemiah was serving the Persian king as his cupbearer, a very intimate position to test his food. And he got a report that the wall in Jerusalem is destroyed. And so he got the king's permission to lead a work to rebuild the wall, and that's what we've been looking at. And there's been external opposition, and there's been internal opposition, and the wall's been rebuilt. But the people realized as they got together to celebrate, they weren't totally free. They were still serving the Persian king. Their land belonged to the king. Their crops belonged to the king. They realized they had gotten into this position because they'd been disobedient to God. They'd walked away. In fact, they'd given their heart to other gods, and they said, we need to get right. So they signed a covenant to give themselves to God, and that's where we pick it up in chapter 10, verse 28. It says, now the rest of the people, the priests, the Levites, the gatekeepers, the singers, the temple servants, and all those who had separated themselves from the peoples of the lands to love God, their wives, their sons, and their daughters, all those who had knowledge and understanding, are joining with their kinsmen, their nobles, and are taking on themselves a curse and an oath to walk in God's law. So they're saying, we're going to walk in the law, and if we don't, we bring God's curse upon us. which was the law which was given through Moses, God's servant, and to keep and to observe all the commandments of God our Lord and his ordinances and statutes. So they said, look, we're committing to doing this, and if we don't, we understand we bring the curse of God on us. And then they add an addendum, verse 30, and we will not give our daughters to the peoples of the land or take their daughters for our sons. So they said, we're not going to give our sons and daughters to marry people of Persia. Now, this is not because of race. This is not because of ethnicity. It is because of spiritual differences. Okay, so this is not a racial thing. It's a spiritual thing. Those people, they don't worship the one true God of Israel. Who knows? They're polytheists. Who knows what they do? We're going to give ourselves to people who have the God of Israel as their one true God. You know, that principle holds for us today in dating and in marriage. Paul said it this way in 2 Corinthians 6, verse 14, do not be bound together with unbelievers. For what partnership have righteousness and lawlessness? Or what fellowship has light with darkness? We're not to be in intimate relationships connected with people who don't have the same faith values that we do. So I'm speaking to those of you who are single. Would you please make your first screen godly character? I don't care how handsome he is. I don't care how beautiful she is. If this person does not have Jesus as the priority that you have, you need to walk away from it. Paul said there's no business linking people who do not believe. It causes stress, marriage. It causes value difference. What do the kids do? Where do we spend our money? Where do we give our time? You say, well, Andy, you know, I'm single and I've been single a while, and boy, I don't have many options in sight. And so when I was in college, a guy who discipled me in the faith said, Andy, never date by default. This is my best option. No, never date by default. And see, when we say, I'm not going to date somebody unless they're a person of faith, we're making a faith statement that God is going to meet our need for intimacy. God is going to meet our need for friendship. So if you're in the process, we're in the next 5 to 10 to 15 or 20 years, you're thinking, I want to be married, would you please make Christian character a screen that you will not compromise? I just won't go forward if this person doesn't value Jesus, doesn't prioritize Jesus like I do. It's a statement of faith. It's a statement of trust. The people go on, verse 31. As for the peoples of the land who bring wares or any grain on the Sabbath day to sell, we will not buy from them on the Sabbath or a holy day. See, God had a Sabbath for his people. I want you to rest. But they found a loophole. We can do nothing, but the people who are coming to the land to buy and sell, we can negotiate and we can do business with them. God says, that's a violation. On the Sabbath, I want you to take a rest from working. You guys, no, that seems harsh. God doesn't want something from us. He wants something for us. To understand that he is the one who ultimately meets our needs, not our job. Because we don't get that right, we can become enslaved to our employer. He speaks and we move, and God is saying, I want you to rest one day a week so you can know that I'm at work even when you're not. I spent the 93-94 school year in Russia, and as such I did some reading on their background and their history. The Communist Party, when they got in control, decided they want more productivity from their people, so they moved the rhythm from resting once every 7 days to once every 10 days. How do you think that worked out for them? What happened to productivity when you started resting every 10th day instead of every 7th day? It declined. You know what they decided to do? To move it back to once every 7 days. because that's where it was most effective and efficient. Does that surprise you? Doesn't surprise me. God, the creator of the universe, set us up to rest every 7 days. Now, in Jesus' day, the Pharisees messed that up because they began to legislate what it means to work and what does it mean. And can you go home and cook a meal? You can microwave, but you can't put in the thing. And can you do yard work, but you can't lift? And you apply the principle in your life where I'm resting and not working because I believe God's going to provide for me. He goes on, and the second part of verse 31, and we will forego the crops the 7th year. That's an agricultural principle. Some of you guys are ag folks. We're going to let the soil be replenished. Now, that's a statement of faith, that you're going to trust God. And, end of verse 31, the extraction of every debt. So that's what that's saying is every 7 years, if you owe me money, I'm going to let it go. Woo, that's pretty big, isn't it? Why would you do that? One, you believe God's going to provide for you. Two, you serve a gracious and generous God. So you're gracious and generous with other people. And we don't apply that exact principle, that exact law today, but I think we can apply the principle. We want to be gracious. We want to be generous in our dealings. Now, I'm not saying we get taken. We need to be shrewd as a serpent, innocent as a dove. Let's do our work when we go to buy a car or a house or whatever. But when we make a deal, can we leave room for the other person to benefit too? Do we have to squeeze every dime from every deal? Philippians 2, 3, and 4 says, consider one another more important than yourselves. Look out not only for your own interest, but the interest of others. In our negotiations, can we look out for the interest of others? When I was on staff at Lincoln Brian, I heard a Christian businessman say, at our company, the owners, we don't ask, how much do we have to pay our employees? We ask, how much can we pay our employees? You catch the difference? What can we, that's considering other people. Now, we've got a limit. We can't pay them endlessly because we've got expenses, we've got overhead, maybe we have capital, but what can we pay our employees? That flies in the face of the culture where I'm going to try and get every dime, and I'll pay you the minimum because I just want to make more for me. No, I need to run a profitable business here, but I need to think about you too. What can you got a family? What can we pay our employees? That is the heart of God. And these people are saying, I want to live as people who trust the Lord. Verses 32 to 39 then are a number of the offerings and the taxes that the people pay to keep the temple going, to support the priests and the Levites who are there. And the principle for us is we give to support the gospel work. Why? Because we got a heart attack of gratitude. We want to be generous. We want the work of God to go forward. We've been touched by the gospel ministry in some way. We want others to be touched. So we have no problem asking you to consider giving. I think it's biblical. Now, we're not going to call you. We're not going to have you fill out a card. But would you consider giving to the gospel work? Because God's people have done it throughout history. Chapter 11, remember, we've got a city, Jerusalem. They built the wall. Finally, we're secure. Finally, we can worship. But they got a problem. They don't have enough people living in the city. So here's how they address it. Verse 1. Now, the leaders of the people lived in Jerusalem, but the rest of the people cast lots to bring 1 out of 10 to live in Jerusalem, the holy city, while 9/10 remained in the other cities. So they cast lots, and if your lots get picked, you got to come in the city, or you will come in the city. Well, why is that? Well, remember, the city has been sacked. It's in the process of being rebuilt. It's not a very nice place to live. But we need some people to populate this, to secure it, to make it a... So will you leave your nice place out there to live in our city? Second, if you live out there, you got more land. Third, it's dangerous to live in the city because if an enemy's going to attack, they're coming after the city. They don't care about the outlying people, at least initially they don't. So they drew lots. But verse 2 says this, and the people blessed all the men who what? Volunteered to live in Jerusalem. So I'm going to give up my nice place to come into the city, which has been sacked and it's not as safe and I don't have as much land. Why would you do that? Because you care about the cause of God, the holy city. I'll give up my comforts to move there. Again, we think about how does this play out today? There are people who serve overseas as missionaries. They go to far less desirable places to live. Why would you do that? Because you think the gospel going forth matters, and you trust that God will fill in the gaps of whatever you're missing from living here, that God is enough, that the place doesn't matter so much. Catch this. There are people I know who live in this city who have chosen to move downtown to the south or the north bottoms. Because see, there are refugees who have come from overseas and they're living in that community and they want to be a part of that community, so they're moving down there. Yeah, we needed to go to the world, but when the world has come to us, why not join them? So these people have left less desirable places in Lincoln to move to, or better, more desirable places to move to less desirable places. Why? Because the gospel matters. And they believe it's a statement of trust that God will fill in the gaps. Still others have downsized. They're taking on less house, less land for the sake of the gospel. When we were with Campus Crusade, we had some friends who were looking for a house, doesn't matter where in Orlando, but they said the realtor kept saying, you can afford more house. We don't need more house. We just need this much house. Well, you can get more house. No, we don't need more house. Why? Because I want resources to give to other things. See, and our culture says you need more, you need the biggest, you need the best, and we don't understand that can enslave us. My last full year at Texas A&M, I was in graduate school. We lived off campus, and we lived in a house right across the street from a pediatrician. And they were renting because they were building a house outside College Station. It was a beautiful house. And they finished it right at the end of the school year. We went over there and saw the house. It was wow. And then I graduate and I work with Campus Crusade. And this couple supports me in ministry. So every year I'd go back and I'd visit them. And about year 3, I go back and I found out they have moved back in town. Well, Dr. Matthews, why'd you do that? I'll never forget his word. Andy, I got tired of being a slave to my house payment. I got tired of that house payment dictating my life. We can get by. We got by for a lot of years in a smaller house. See, God wants, what does He want for us? He wants freedom from having to have the newest, coolest, whatever thing. And we're seeing a people who trust Him, who give up a more desirable land to move into the city of Jerusalem because they think He's worth it. They think He can fill in the gap. It's a statement of faith. It's a statement of trust. Verse 3 then says this, now these are the heads of the provinces who lived in Jerusalem, but in the cities of Judah, each lived in his own property. In their cities, the Israelites, the priests, the Levites, the temple servants, and the descendants of Solomon's servants. The rest of the chapter then is a kind of a listing of the people who lived outside the city, break them down by tribe, by work, tribe of Benjamin, priests, Levites, other temple attendants. Verses 25 through 36 then give a list of the towns, other cities that surround Jerusalem. Chapter 12 then, we're going to move to the celebration. Remember, this is a work of restoration. It was a destroyed wall. The opponent said, you'll never be able to do this. And God has restored this wall in 52 days. Okay, so chapter 12, from verses 1 to 26, gives an unbroken lineage of the priests and Levites who returned from Babylon, modern-day Iraq, to Jerusalem. And it tells about the priests in the first wave, the Levites, the high priests. It anchors the chronology in Persian records. It's a list of all those people. So let's pick it up in verse 27. It says, now at the dedication of the wall of Jerusalem, they sought out the Levites from all their places to bring them to Jerusalem so that they might celebrate the dedication with gladness, with hymns of thanksgiving and with songs to the accompaniment of cymbals, harps, and lyres. Why do we sing every service on Sunday? Is it just to fill some time? No. We're following a history. God's people have always celebrated him. So we're not just getting ready for the sermon, we're celebrating God. And this is what they're doing. Verse 28 and 29, so the sons of the singers were assembled from the district around Jerusalem and from the village of the Nephthalites and from Beth Gilgal and from their fields in Jeba and Asmith, for the singers had built for themselves villages around Jerusalem. So they're calling people in. The priests and the Levites purified themselves. They're getting themselves ready to worship. They also purified the people, the gates, and the walls. Verses 31 through 42 then talk about the details of the celebration. I'm going to bump ahead to verse 43. And then that day they offered great sacrifices and rejoiced because God had given them great joy. Even the women and children rejoiced, so that the joy of Jerusalem was heard from afar. You could hear this everywhere. The joy couldn't be contained. Why? Because there was 52 days ago, there was a city that they had no security in, and there were opponents who said, you'll never get it done, and they were determined to stop them, and they had internal opposition, and God worked through all that, and in 52 days, the work has been done, and they're celebrating, and the joy can't be contained. A work of restoration. So yesterday, about 10 a.m. or so, I get a text from my wife. Hey, you want to go to the volleyball game tonight? Well, sure. A work colleague, a sister had tickets, and it's a tough ticket to get, so we jumped on it. So we went out, and they played the Hoosiers in volleyball, and they won in 3 sets. They swept them. Do you know, maybe you know this, but I'm going to see if you know. When Nebraska gets a block, what do you do? You go, roof, right? Gosh, you guys, in the first service, they were a lot more into that. My poor wife really struggled with that. I had to help her with that, the roof. But you know, they I got the evil eye. People, I'm in trouble. I may need another place to sleep tonight. But you know, every point, everything was a celebration. Woo! Now let me roll it ahead. And let's say the Huskers run the table. Okay, so we get through Christmas. So we're going to celebrate a national championship. And it's going to be held in Pinnacle Bank Arena. How hard do you think it'll be to get a ticket to get in there? Oh, it'd be real hard, won't it? Everybody want to be there. And you think it'll be quiet? Shh. Will it be a quiet celebration? No. You'll be able to hear the celebration all around the Haymarket, right? Because they won the national championship. Here's my question. How much more with a God who is restoring people to himself? With a God who restored the wall? See, think about where we've been. We started with people taking a curse themselves, obey the law, and they said, we're not going to give our sons and daughters in marriage. And that's a statement of faith. God, I believe you're going to provide even when I don't have a spouse. I'm going to trust you. And we talked about finances. We're going to release debt. We applied the principle. We're going to be generous. We're going to consider others. We're not going to squeeze every penny out of it. We're going to ask, what can we pay people? Well, again, that's a statement of trust. God will provide. So I can be Christ in my community by being generous with that person. Then we talked about living conditions. People who'd give up a more desirable place for a less desirable place. Well, why would you do that? Because the gospel going forward matters. And again, it's a statement of trust. I believe you'll fill in the gap there. And we talked about the Sabbath, right? We're going to take a day off. Again, it's a statement of trust. I believe you'll provide even when I'm not working. And then we're going to celebrate this restoration because we love the Lord who's restored us. See, we ask this question, how should we respond to God's work of restoration? Here's what I'd say. We should respond to God's work of restoration by trusting and loving him with all our heart. By trusting and loving him with all our heart. The way we measure our trust and love of God is our obedience. Our obedience tells us how we're doing at trusting and loving God. Jesus said, if you love me, you'll obey me. And he came to demonstrate God's love and God's work of restoration. That's what we got here. This work, the wall in 52 days, looks forward to a far greater work of restoration. That's Jesus bringing us back to himself. How great was the work? Let me see if I can demonstrate it. Ephesians 2, 1-3. This is where we were before we came to Jesus. Okay, this is your condition and my condition before we come to Jesus. You were dead in your trespasses and sins. How's that for a start? Okay, get this. In which you firmly walked according to the course of this world, according to the prince of the power of the air. That's Satan. So you were being played by Satan, the spirit that's now working in the sons of disobedience. Among them we too all formerly lived in the lusts of our flesh. If we felt it, we had to have it. We were slaves to our desires, indulging the desires of the flesh and of the mind. Here's our destiny, and we're by nature children of wrath, even as the rest. You know who that is? That's you, and that's me before Jesus. You talk about a need for restoration. You talk about a need for restoration. That's it. Fortunately, that passage doesn't stop at verse 3. That's the good news. It doesn't stop. It starts again in verse 4 with the word but, which means a transition's coming. Here's the transition. You ready for the transition? Here we go. But God, even though you and I were a wreck, being rich in mercy because of his great love with which he loved us, even when we were dead in our transgressions, all that stuff we read in the first 3 verses, did what? Made us alive together with Christ. By grace you have been saved. See, the 52 days looks forward to an even greater work of restoration. That's Jesus. A couple of weeks ago, I was driving by a body shop, and there were a couple cars outside that were just trashed. I don't know body work, but I thought, that car's going to the scrapyard. I mean, the damage is too great. You understand we were headed for the scrapyard? You're done. You're done. We'll part you out, and somebody maybe could come take an alternator or something, but you're done. But, verse 4 says, God, being rich in mercy, we have been blessed, favored with God's work of restoration. We respond by trusting and loving him with all our heart. St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York was dedicated in 1878. It took 20 years to build it. In 2008, a work of restoration began because the thing was falling apart. It took 9 years to complete that. More than 150 workers made 30,000 separate interventions, planned and tracked with advanced software but executed by hand. Workers filled the interior with scaffolding. Specialists climbed up to heal cracks in stained glass, fix shattered bits of tracery with invisible puzzle pieces of steel, scour soot off the blackened marble, rebuild eroded filigree, replace crumbling stones, replaster ribbed vaults, and revivify wooden screens. But the most impressive tasks weren't even visible. Replacing the entire cooling and heating system and hooking them up to geothermal wells that had been sunk 2,200 feet below Manhattan's asphalt crust. That's a work of restoration. Man, that took a lot, didn't it? How many people, how many things, how much cost, how much expertise? You understand what I described falls short of what God did in your heart and mine? God has done a far greater work of restoration if you're a follower of Jesus. We celebrate that by loving and trusting him with all our heart. Would you pray with me? Our Father in heaven, we're grateful for your work in our lives. We certainly weren't deserving, but you worked anyway. Thank you, Jesus. And thank you that what went on in the book of Nehemiah just foreshadows, looks forward to the great work that you're doing all around the world in the lives of people through the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. It's in his name that we pray. Amen.